Hey everybody, Nick Drost here from Elastic, and I'm going to go over a really awesome feature that we released in the 5.x timeframe called cross-cluster search. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to frame this conversation up into how we could use cross-cluster search if we have multiple clusters that we need to search through, but maybe we want to aggregate a higher level view in one instance of Kibana. So what I have in front of you here is I have a logging cluster. So I'm actually taking a file beat on my MacBook here, and I'm grabbing the system.log and I'm sending that to one cluster. And I also have a metrics cluster. So I'm taking things like process information, CPU memory off of my MacBook as well. And I'm sending that to a separate metrics cluster. And this is a pretty common use case with our customers. Maybe I want to send different types of logs to one cluster and send another set of logs to another cluster. Maybe I want a separate metrics cluster so that I can treat that differently. And maybe I want different people using different clusters. And the question always comes back to, well, how can I see an aggregated view of what's happening in these different clusters if I'm, say, a part of the SecOps team, or maybe I'm a part of the admin team that's responsible for all these different things. So we can actually go ahead and do that. So the first thing I want to do is I actually want to go in and create a connection from my logging cluster to my metrics cluster. And I can go ahead and do that by running this command here, where I tell this cluster to be aware of the metrics cluster, and because they share the same certificate authority and I have the same username in both clusters, we will actually be able to view the data in that other cluster. And so I can actually test that by hitting the remote info API endpoint here, and you'll see indeed we are actually connected to that cluster here with the connected as true. So now what can I do? Well, I can actually go into management and index patterns. Most of you should be familiar with how to create an index pattern, but we can create an index pattern that is actually aware of the cross-cluster search or the remote cluster. So I'm going to define an index pattern that is going to have the prefix of the remote cluster. In this case, it was metric cluster. I'm going to say, I'd like to take a look at all the metric beat indices and make them available in this cluster. I'm going to just grab my timestamp here and create an index pattern. And you'll see that I have my default index pattern, which is a part of my logging cluster. And I also have this remote index pattern now. So now if I go to my Discover pane, I can actually select the remote metrics, and I essentially get the same view that I had in my remote metrics cluster. Pretty cool, right? But I could do more. So what if I wanted to actually create a dashboard and I wanted to mash these things up? I can actually do that. So I'm going to create a new dashboard. I'm going to add a save search here I have for the syslog logs. So this will just show them in a tabular format, the syslog logs that are coming from my MacBook. And I'm also going to grab the CPU usage, and there we have it. So I have logs coming from the local cluster, the syslogs, and I also have the CPU information coming from that remote cluster sitting in a single dashboard. Pretty exciting, but it actually doesn't stop there. So I can actually run machine learning jobs from this machine learning job on this cluster against the remote data. And so how I do that is I go into machine learning here and I create a new job. And again, that metric cluster, metric beat index pattern shows up. I can go ahead and select that. I'm going to just do a single metric here because it's more important that I can actually run this against the remote cluster than the data I have in here, because I don't have a lot of data. But I could do a high count aggregation, use the full data here and run it. Again, I have some holes in my data here, but again, the important thing is that I can now run machine learning jobs across to a remote cluster. So where this is applicable is if I have maybe clusters that are close to networking gear that I have, and I don't want to go through multiple hops because I have a lot of data flowing into my cluster, but I want to do maybe a hub and spoke type model where I need a central aggregation point where I could run machine learning jobs or aggregate them into a Kibana UI. I could then use cross-cluster search to do that for me. So again, thanks for joining me today. We reviewed how to link up two clusters using cross-cluster search, how to create an index pattern using cross-cluster search, how I could create a dashboard with two separate visualizations from two separate sources, and how I could also run a remote machine learning job. Thanks, everybody.